But they don't like the answer.
Good morning. Good morning. Welcome to the panel on A Glance Through the Global Trade Window. Do you like the view? I'm Adrian Wooldridge. I work for The Economist. And what we're basically talking about is the way that global integration, free flows of capital, increasingly free flows of goods, have created and driven a lot of the prosperity of the last 30 years, but we seem to have come to a point where that is perhaps no longer sustainable, certainly where we have a huge populist backlash against that process of liberalization. And we're going to try and tease out some of the implications of that fact. And to discuss this, we have Ailish Campbell on my far right, Chief Trade Commissioner of Canada and Assistant Deputy Minister for International Business Development, Global Affairs Canada. In Goldin, Professor of Globalisation and Development at the University of Oxford and Director of the Oxford Martin Programme on Technological and Economic Change. And I must say that when I was at Oxford, we didn't even have the word globalisation, let alone a professor of globalisation. Rhonda Smichline, Chairman of the US International Trade Commission, and on my far left, William Lee, Chief Economist of the Milken Institute. And I'd like to start off by asking Ailish Campbell to talk for a few minutes, actually, about CETA, what it is, how it was negotiated, and what are its merits or possible demerits. Perhaps you won't be so eloquent on the demerits as on the merits. Please talk about the CETA.
Happy to. The CanadaEU, Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement, otherwise known as CETA. And I can understand at several vectors why there might be interest in this agreement, particularly here in the United Kingdom. Let me just tell you a few things about it, some stylized facts. 25% of our trade had tariffs on it before the agreement, and now 98% is duty-free. So we've gone basically to almost full liberalization, and we'll go to 99% tariff-free in 7 years. And it won't surprise you, some sticky agricultural products on which people wanted longer transitions are in that 1%. Most importantly, the agreement covers everything from services to e-commerce, to small business and competition. I think it's much broader, and that's why we called it the Comprehensive Economic and Trade Agreement. It actually covers issues including labor, the environment, sustainable development. It allows for mutual recognition of certification. It allows for us to set up panels between our regulated industries to work towards mutual standards on particular professions, and a high degree of labor mobility for skilled professionals. So it's an incredibly wide-ranging deal. What I can also tell you, which I think is very important in the current context, it took 10 years to negotiate. The good news is now the template is there. So, I mean, if only I could monetize, if only I had copyright on the agreement, I'd be happy to help people photocopy it for a fee. But it's a great agreement because I think like everything that Canada does and that the European Union does, and I give credit, the Commission was a very hard entity, frankly, to negotiate with. You're negotiating not just with the Commission, but of course now with the member states. We're going through a ratification process where those elements that are not under EU competency now need to be ratified by all member states. Thrilled that countries like Denmark and Spain and many others have already proceeded with the ratification process. But what I can also tell you is it involved our sub-federal actors, and that's one of the things that made the process very unique. So our provinces were at the negotiating table with us federally. We involved sub-federal areas of jurisdiction, most specifically and challengingly procurement. And procurement is a huge issue, a huge opportunity, including for small and medium-sized enterprises here in Europe. So happy to talk in more detail about specific aspects of it. But the last message I'd leave is, of course, that the Canada-EU trade deal is also our free trade deal with the United Kingdom until it's not. And so right now we're enjoying free trade with the United Kingdom, and we'll continue to work lockstep with this government as they determine what their path forward is.
And you say until it's not. How difficult will it be to revive it when we leave the EU?
I think it won't surprise you. Canada is also in a very similar situation to the UK now. We're undergoing an incredibly complex set of negotiations in NAFTA. And you're having to do the same thing we are, which is plan for multiple scenarios. So in one scenario, which we don't know, we can talk about probable futures later. We'll assign confidence ratios to each of those possible futures. But in one possible future, if the United Kingdom has a hard exit, a completely hard exit, I mean, the Canada-EU CETA deal stands as a template that either could be expanded or, like I said, we'll charge you, I got to work out the fee, but we'll help you photocopy it, and would serve as a template. Yeah, well, we're going to work on it.
Oh, okay.
We'll figure that out over the break. But it stands as a model, and I think there's other models out there. You know, the EFTA model, the Norwegian relationship. There's all kinds of different gradations. But we've crossed that Rubicon. We've taken, we see the integration of certainly market economies and increasingly emerging and developed economies is incredibly important, based on some fundamental principles that I would argue are what keeps us very bullish on the UK, which is your rule of law, strong enforcement of that. I mean, I like to joke that the UK might have been the only country that was actually going to implement the entire data protection law, because the UK has such a high adherence rate to international and, of course, even domestic law. So that same tradition is alive and well in Canada.
And just one more question before I broaden out the discussion, which is, you said it took you 10 years to negotiate. How many professional trade negotiators do you have?
We have a lot. We have the best, first of all.
Can
tried
you
to hire
hire them
a few.
out?
You tried to hire a few. Yeah, they're a little bit busy on NAFTA. Let's get through that first. What I can also tell you is that the United Kingdom, in some ways, is going to have to rediscover itself on the negotiation front. That work, quite rightly, had migrated to Brussels. That market integration is a technical series of work. I have full confidence that you'll find the right skill set. We need to move through this period of uncertainty, I would argue, very quickly. That's the best thing we could do for our business, as well as for our society.
Thank you. I'm now going to broaden out the discussion. I wanted to start off by asking the panel in general, but starting with Bill Lee and working downwards. Are we at the end of a stage, of a phase of globalization? Is it all coming to an end?
I certainly hope so in some sense, because in fact, I'm glad Ailish started off the conversation the way she did, because she said it took 10 years to negotiate free trade. Negotiating free trade, almost an oxymoron, no? Because how do you, let's face it, all around the world, there's not one place we can find free trade. And so when you say, is globalization coming to an end? Well, I don't think we ever had free trade globalization. We never had the kind of globalization that our textbooks talked about, where we expand the production possibility frontier, we have consumers having a richer menu of goods to consume, and higher incomes to produce the things to which the country has comparative advantage. Instead, we've had a world of distorted trade, where agreements around the world have tried to maximize the benefits of people who are within that agreement and at the expense of those who are outside of that agreement. And as Ailish said, those agreements can be copyrighted or copied all over the place, but that means that you have distorted trade all over the place. So let's begin with the premise: we don't have free trade, we have distorted trade. And so if you're going to make it freer, you're going to make it broader, then that means that you really are trying to work in the world of what the economists call the second best. And by changing something here, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're improving something somewhere else. It may be that you're doing it at the expense of somewhere else. So what I think is the new wave of globalization, where you try to take into account the gains to those in your domestic economy by entering into a trade agreement, and take into account the losses. And when I used to teach trade at Columbia, I used to say, remember, right, the benefits of trade is that everyone is better off if you take those who win and take some of that income and give it back to those who lose out long enough so that they could actually move from the sectors that are shrinking to the sectors that are expanding. So far, globalization has not done that. Right? We've had the benefits accruing, but we have not made up for the losses. And I think that the new phase of globalization, if we try to do a bilateral approach, might actually address that in a better way. It might take less than 10 years to negotiate a one-size-fits-all type of trade treaty.
Rhonda. And can you explain also your relationship with the Trump administration?
Okay, well, yes, so I have to give the disclaimer that I'm only speaking for myself. I'm not speaking for the Commission, the ITC, or my fellow commissioners, of which there are currently 3, but typically we are at a compilation of 6. So the ITC is a very unique organization. I'm sure Ailish is, I know she's familiar with it, but we do not do trade policy. The Commission, it supports policymakers in the United States. So we have 3 main roles, one of which is we have a staff of economists, and we are charged with analyzing the economic impacts of trade agreements on the U.S. economy. So the ITC has put out, some of you might be familiar with them, a number of quite voluminous reports. So when the United States was contemplating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the ITC put out a very lengthy report analyzing the potential impact of that agreement on the United States economy, and that also it also went into what the potential effects globally would be. So that's an example. The other 2 areas where our main responsibilities include anti-dumping and countervailing duties. So in the United States, that process is bifurcated. You have the Commerce Department determining whether or not there is dumping or subsidization. The Commerce Department is obviously a part of the administration, no matter who sits in the White House. And then you have the ITC, who determines whether or not the domestic industry has been injured by reason of imports. We don't sit in the administration. We are an independent, bipartisan agency. So I just want to make that clear. So we do provide technical assistance to USTR in the course of negotiations. So with regard to the ongoing NAFTA negotiations, we will have staff who will sit in with the USTR negotiators, helping them usually on issues having to do with AD/CVD or other impacts. So just with that sort of explanation, so I'm not sure how many current federal officials are speaking here at the Milken Institute, but just wanted to make that clear, especially since it's being videotaped.
So are we reaching the end of a particular phase of globalization?
Well, I think what Bill said is very true, and I'm glad to hear an economist acknowledge that there never has been truly free trade, that there's always distortions in trade. Having said that, I mean, obviously there are a lot of benefits to the liberalization of trade that's occurred over the last 25 years. And you know, the ITC has certainly documented that in the reports that we've put out. I think you are going to see, you know, it's natural that we see a slowing down, if you will, of the benefits of that, because a lot of the opportunities have already been exploited. So the conclusion of the Uruguay round 25 years ago, the creation of the WTO and the dispute settlement system, the evolution of digital technologies, all of these things have propelled the growth that we saw in trade flows, which is how you described or defined globalization at the beginning of this, right? The increase in the cross-border flow or other modes of goods and services. So I think it's natural that you're going to see a slowdown in that growth, but I do think, as Bill said, that you're going to have to see some of the losers, if you will, the people who are adversely affected, affirmatively adversely affected, not just not benefiting from liberalization. Those people have now stood up, and I think that to see further liberalization in trade, you're going to have to see a response to that, and that response can take many different forms. And what you're seeing right now with the Trump administration is, I mean, you know, obviously we have trade adjustment assistance in the United States, which is a program to help workers that have been displaced by trade, you know, other forms of social safety nets. The Trump administration has decided to renegotiate or attempt to renegotiate certain agreements because the balance that was struck in those agreements, they want to rebalance, so, and try to bring some jobs back to the United States in that way. So we'll see if that works, but.
And modernized to be.
Well, and I was going to say, like, there is a valid,
changing economies.
Of course, and NAFTA's over 20 years old, so I think it's a fair approach to want to renegotiate. renegotiate that. Canada and Mexico were a part of TPP, so essentially, in some respects, NAFTA got renegotiated in the TPP, right? Same thing with Korea, right? The Trump administration has open negotiations with the Korean government with regard to the free trade agreement that we have. So, you know, they weren't part of TPP, but I think it's not unreasonable to want to improve these things, but the devil's always in the details.
Ian, same question to you.
Yeah, I certainly don't think we're at the end of globalization. The way I define globalization is not only the flows of goods and services, but also of ideas. And actually, I also disagree with Bill, because there has been the creation of the biggest free trade zone the world's ever known, which is the European Union, where there is absolutely free trade between 25 countries. So, and NAFTA was a large approach towards that. So we've seen a massive reduction in tariffs around the world, a huge progress over the last 25 years or so. And we're now getting into the really difficult areas, which is tariffs are basically very low. They can't go much lower on most things for most countries. And so we're into consumer preferences. We're into phytosanitary, we're into people's choices around what they want to consume. And that is much more difficult because then you really are into trade-offs between whether you want GMOs or not, or whether you want nuclear power or not, whether you think you should tax carbon or not, and those very different choices to the past trade debates. But I have no doubt they're playing through. I also think if you look at the global level, there's much more flow, and it's mainly because the advanced economies represented here are a smaller and smaller part of the picture. The real story is the integration of China with the global, and particularly developing countries, India and other countries. So when you look at the aggregate numbers, it's not a gloomy picture at all. Trade growth this year is higher than it has been for a very long time. It's higher than GDP growth. GDP growth is rising to its highest levels ever. Certainly, if you look at the size of the world economy and put the percentage on it, there's much more happening than ever before. And trade growth being faster than GDP growth is actually a very surprising thing. Partly because as we move further and further up the income level and we get more and more digitalization, we go into dematerialized economies. So increasingly, I think what's really going to challenge trade flows is 3D printing and robotics, localization, where the price of capital, not the price of labor, will determine production location. And in that, you'll get a great reshoring going on, but not of people and jobs. Finally, I would absolutely agree with all the previous speakers that in the end, this is about the capacity to redistribute the gains. That is not a between-country story. That's a within-country story. And the crucial question is what's globalizing taxes? In other words, you have global firms offshoring to small tax-free places. You have super rich individuals, and the capacity of governments to capture fiscal revenue is declining with globalization, and there's a race to the bottom across the thing. That makes it extremely difficult to redistribute, and that pressure is increasing. The great irony of Brexit and of Trump and of all of these politics is, of course, they'll make the problem much worse, not better. They will reduce cooperation on this race to the bottom. They will participate in the race to the bottom. Indeed, the tax breaks in the US are an acceleration of that. And you're going to get greater inequality and more pushback and more protectionism. But that is an advanced economy story. This is not the story of China and India and other countries which used to be vehemently opposed to globalization and now, ironically, are the champions of it.
Ailish?
No, I would build on that last point, and I would say, so redistribution is one aspect of that. So market economy and having effective fiscal systems and public institutions that allow for that redistribution. But let's go back a step before. And I think what we're hearing from the panel, if I could try and sort of build on some of the comments that we've heard this morning and take it to the next level, is, of course, trade agreements cannot be everything. A society is not its monetary policy. It's not its trade policy. The UK is not its decision on Brexit. So what is the Canadian society telling us? What are we feeling when we go around the world and speak with people? I mean, certainly public institutions, domestic institutions matter greatly, and particularly education, social health systems, mental health systems. And what we're hearing from people when we talk about open markets, and Canada has one of the populations that's the most supportive of open markets, free trade, immigration, diversity, talent. Why is that? I mean, clearly because other than our First Nations, who we are now listening to with greater intention, we're all immigrants. So that history, of course, makes it easier for us to be open. But it doesn't mean that we're not vulnerable to some of the same issues that are going on in the United States that are clearly anti-immigrant, and we are working actively on policies of inclusion. The fact that we have a public education system that is free, that is incredibly high quality, and that upper middle class people want to be part of is incredibly important. Ian, you were talking about India and China. I'm particularly fascinated with the growth markets in Asia and what their household incomes are being attributed to. We are overweighted in North America on housing, and we're underweighted on what we spend on in terms of education. Now, in Canada, that's because you can go to a free school. You can go to a free school. In the United States, if you're overweighted on housing, that's a huge problem for a lower and middle income family because they can't afford high quality education. In Singapore, families are spending 25% of their aftermarket income on tutoring, supplementary educational activities, and sort of, if you will, developing the next generation. This level of investment is incredible, but then again, take it back to other societies. People are keenly aware not only of their current economic situation, but they're wondering about the future of their children. And you and I both know, you talked about the fourth industrial revolution, 3D printing, trade and data. All we know is these, progress will never be slower than it is at this moment because things are just accelerating at such a rate. So that's why we can't just have a conversation about trade. Like The View, I don't like The View if we're only looking at one window. We have to build the whole house.
I'm slightly worried that the consensus on this panel is becoming too optimistic about the future of globalization. So I will add some much needed pessimism to the picture. I actually think there's a very strong case to be made that we are moving towards the end of a particular era of liberal globalization, that the big parallel I would draw is between the first stage of globalization, between about 1870 and 1914, which ended in disaster. And I think that we're at the beginning of that disaster coming again. I think globalization was driven by the active and creative role of the United States in driving globalization from 1945 onwards. The world's largest economy, it also happened to be a liberal and democratic society, drove globalization through responsible engagement with the rest of the world. I think that responsible engagement is beginning to decline. It's declined certainly under Trump. I think it had also begun to decline under Obama. We're moving much more towards the position of the 1920s, where the United States withdrew into itself, didn't play a creative role in the world economy, and therefore helped to create a lot of disruptions throughout the world economy. So I think that we're more like at the end of the 1920s, moving towards the 1930s with massive disruption of the global economy than we are at an earlier period. But I think it's important to have a little bit of pessimism here. Now I'd like to say, was this global age, this golden age of globalization that we've just been through, with, as the title of the paper said, increasingly open markets in trade and financial flows, integrating the global economy. Was it really such a wonderful age as many people on this panel have been implying? We had essentially in that period stagnant wages for large numbers of people in the West, particularly in the United States and in Great Britain. We had slow and declining productivity growth. So productivity growth in the West was actually much slower during the age of liberal globalization than it was in the 60s and 70s with restrained, managed globalization. We had a huge shock from China, but then you had a lot of very, very cheap, forced, appalling race to the bottom labor in China and in India. Wasn't it all a great ramp for the bankers and a few people who profited from it, but a bit of an awful thing for large numbers of people in the West? And you're now getting your comeuppance for preaching this facile doctrine. Bill.
Wouldn't it be great if all you needed to do to make money was to have cheap labor? Yet in the US, we have probably the largest capital inflows coming into high-wage areas, Silicon Valley and technology. So money flows where productivity is the highest, where investors can see a rate of return. And I think one of the things that we need to keep in mind is that the next stage of globalization is going to be in ideas, but also in enforcing best practice around the world, because the source of best practice is spread through trade of ideas in particular. And as academics and immigrants come into the country, that is the source of where the wealth of that country can
But
grow.
productivity growth in America has been dismal.
Precisely because the secret sauce for productivity is not so much investment. In fact, the lack of investment accounts for about a third of the drop-off in productivity since the 90s. It's multi-factor productivity. It's how talent, capital, and technology can mix together. And that involves a bigger picture, a regulatory environment, the social environment that you have, the institutions that you have, the schools that you have to produce the talent that's needed in the future, not the talent that was needed in the past. So a lot of these changes that are taking place did not take place in the US. Our school system went from a decent one to a crummy one. And one of the things that we have not addressed are these social institutions that would enable us to make use of the global opportunities there are. And so the opportunities for investment have gone to China, which now has state-of-the-art fintech, or have gone to India or other places. So I think one of the policy measures that can be done is to revamp these social institutions to be able to make use of the next phase of
But
globalization.
the world's two most globalized economies, the most liberal economies, i.e. the United States and Great Britain, have been the ones that have suffered from stagnant income and declining productivity.
Well,
there
you've
must be something in globalization that's not benefiting
But you're
advanced
comparing apples
economies.
and oranges, right? I mean, let's take our neighbors, right? Canada and U.S. U.S. trade share has gone from about 15% of GDP to about 30%, a relatively closed economy, whereas Canada is you sort of one minus that, right? I mean, your economy is based on massive openness, massive trade flows, and the benefits that accrue to a small country like Canada come mainly from trade. A large country, it comes mainly from domestic developments. So remember the first theorem of international trade, small country, big country. They open up the trade, who gains the most? Small country. Why? Because their terms of trade change the most. So when President Trump goes around saying, the US has been at the raw end of every trade deal we've ever gone into, well, there's some economics to that because the initial conditions are the big country gained the least, relatively speaking. So in terms of talking about trade policies, having a more bilateral approach that allows you to get away from the one-size-fits-all, it takes forever to negotiate type policies, into ones where you can say, where can I get the redistribution right? How can I address industry by industry what features are needed to change the terms of trade with my counterparties to be able to benefit my national income and national job growth?
Can I just challenge you on that? Only because, I mean, I say this as someone as a former trade negotiator and now as the head of the Canadian Commercial Service, the Trade Commissioner Service. Government is always, I won't say always, in the economy, government is often the lagging indicator.
Yes.
We're just trying to catch up with business. On society, we're often the leading indicator. I mean, we can change rules on inclusion, recognizing gay marriage, giving the vote to women. I mean, the government was ahead of society on many of these things. And together, we have to coexist around values. And where I'm headed with that is only our greatest challenge now is actually that the greatest benefits are accruing to industries that are not terribly well regulated, that are based largely on digital and data flows, which we don't, and I'm in no way suggesting this, but like they're not taxed, they flow freely, and as a result, benefits are accruing to a very small number of people, and our current systems don't redistribute, frankly, as aggressively or with enough intention to counter what are the inevitable results of mass amounts of inequality. And so that's the new globalization. Where are we headed on that is maybe where.
But that would have happened without
Did I just
globalization,
start
because that's,
moderating?
you're talking about technological
Rhonda,
progress.
let's have,
It's
then-
Facebook versus Google and everybody else. You're telling us we need to tax the shareholders of Google and Facebook in order to pay off the industrial worker that lost his job. I think that's not the right policy.
No, I'm not, I asked an open question because I think it's something we're all struggling with and we're. gonna keep
Rhonda, let's go ahead here. Let's,
Well, I guess I would
The
agree.
golden
I would
age, was
agree
it
with-
really golden?
Right, I would agree. The United States benefited enormously from the opening of markets, right? From the creation of the WTO, the Uruguay round. I mean, when you look at the United States economy today, right, 80% of the GDP is services. Roughly 80% of employment is services. I mean, that number to me just blows me away, that fully 80% people employed in the United States are in the services industries.
That's right.
Those have benefited enormously from the opening of markets and so forth, and also from the change in technology. I mean, you can't ignore that. That was just as much of a part of this as the trade agreements. But as you said, there have been a number of people that have not only not benefited, but have actually been adversely affected. And what you saw in this last election, I think, is those people found a voice, and they found somebody who was willing to listen to them. And so unless, and economists have known this all along, this is not, I think, something that was not known. Everybody knows that there were going to be winners and losers when you enter into a trade agreement. That is the nature of a negotiation. You give something up in order to get something. So there were always people that were not going to benefit and that were going to be adversely affected. And it's just a question of what was done to assist them in that displacement. And I don't think, obviously, enough has been done. And trade agreements and wage stagnation has other causes as well, but the trade agreements, as I mentioned, even the ITC has come out and said, well, if you read one of our lengthy reports, so we did a report in the summer of 2016 where we analyzed the economic effect on the US economy of 3 decades of trade agreements, right? So it was an incredibly complicated report where we looked at every trade agreement the United States had entered into since 1987 and tried to estimate what has been the economic impact on the US economy of that. And if you look at that report, of course, there is a net positive in terms of GDP growth, consumer welfare, meaning, lower prices, more choice, but it did actually exacerbate the gap between skilled and unskilled workers.
Ian, the golden age,
Affirmatively.
defend it.
Globalization, good, bad, and ugly. So it depends, it's certainly been the golden age for the world as a whole. There's never been a period of history which has had more progress more rapidly than this period, ever. Look at life expectancy, look at incomes, look at poverty reduction, look at key indicators, and it would be impossible to make the argument that this has been bad for the world. Has it been bad for the rich countries? Globalization is bad because it spreads systemic risk. So the butterfly defect, when you connect, not only good things connect, you have cascading financial crises, you have ISIS being the largest recruiter of foreign fighters since the Spanish Civil War using social media, you have spreading pandemics, you have climate change, the unintended spillovers, rising antibiotic resistance. But that's the price of progress and connectivity. Can we manage them? If we have the capabilities, if we're prepared to have globalization and give up some national sovereignty, and that's the trade-off. This is a renaissance moment for humanity. It is by far the most creative time, which is why this is the slowest hour you'll know for the rest of your lives. In that pace of change, people get left behind more quickly. And far from, as my friend Tom Freeman says, the world getting flatter with globalization, it gets much more mountainous. Place matters more than ever. The dynamic cities are doing incredibly well. The people that are changing fastest are the happiest. And the places that have the highest share of immigrants, like Toronto, like London, like the coastal cities in the US, don't vote against connectivity. They're the people that do not support Trump or Brexit or Marine Le Pen in France and AfD in Germany and elsewhere. It's the people left behind. It's the people locked out of change. So if you want to address it, you've got to address things like housing markets, transport systems, and housing mobility. Finally, on your productivity question, this is right at the center of my work at the moment. We've got a list of 16 reasons why we have this productivity paradox, where innovation is accelerating, and there's lots and lots of proof of that, and yet productivity is stagnating. It's not stagnating everywhere. It's stagnating in certain countries on aggregate. If you go to the dynamic places, measure productivity in Silicon Valley or in London, you see massive growth. And the tail is getting longer. There are lots of explanations. There's a measurement question. We aren't picking up any of the benefits of the digitalization period. In fact, it's destroying my mobile phone, has destroyed cameras, GPS systems, music systems, etc. Negative productivity. It also goes down when you reduce things like health needs, etc. You have lower output in your economy. So there's lots of measurement issues which are at the heart of it. There's lots of questions about whether cheap credit and quantitative easing has slowed productivity down because it's keeping alive more and more zombie firms. Credit is too cheap. And there's lots of questions about how you ensure that the rate of churn, the Schumpeterian processes, happen more rapidly to raise productivity. There's big questions on robotics and robotic absorption rates. The UK has the lowest level of robotic absorption of any advanced economy. It's dragging itself into the future slower than other places. Those things matter to productivity growth. Don't blame globalization for it. Blame other things. And finally, I think we need to rise above our national interests and say, what do we care about in the world? Yep. Do we care about poverty? Do we care about being a better species, having more rapid creativity, solving cancer, solving climate change? And if we care about those things, it'd be very difficult to say that we aren't in a golden age.
Golden age. One of the things that's surprised me about this discussion so far is that apart from Ian hinting at it, nobody seems to have addressed the issue of the global financial crisis. The global financial crisis is a direct result of the liberalization of financial flows and resulted in the destruction of as much wealth as we've seen destroyed since the 1930s. This was an incredible act of hubris. We all said to everybody, look, we've got to liberalize these capital flows. We know how to manage capital flows. We know how to manage the economy. And then we didn't know how to do it. Huge destruction of wealth. It will be until the 2020s that the average worker in this country
Adrian,
will have the same living standards that they had before the global financial crisis.
Just on the financial crisis.
How does that work with your globalization and glossinarism?
It's the butterfly defect.
It's more than the butterfly defect.
Butterfly defect is
it's
systemic.
It's central to capitalism, capital flows, and it didn't work.
Okay, a number of things.
Sorry,
one is, I would argue, we wouldn't have Brexit and Trump if we hadn't had the financial crisis. We wouldn't have the collapse in belief in experts and authority. Finance is the global expert system. Our banks are well paid because we think they know what they're doing. Our central banks, our treasuries are the elite of national governance, and the IMF is the elite of international governance. This system, which is by far the best expert system in the world, with the most data, the most power, the best pay, and a very narrow mission, which is financial stability, proved itself totally incapable. Totally. Okay, don't blame globalization for that. Blame the lack of imagination, the race to the bottom in regulation, the politicians, the failure to understand globalization, to analyze systemic risk. Everyone knew there would be a financial crisis. As was said, we can't take away the punch bowl while the party's going. As was said at the time, don't worry, it's rational. It was a total fail of imagination and regulation and politics.
Don't blame globalization for something that is at the very, very heart of globalization.
China experienced the most rapid integration into global markets and had no financial crisis. Why?
Because they're catching up. They're playing a catch-up game.
No, because they managed it astutely. Singapore didn't have it. South Africa actually never had a financial crisis.
Ian, look over here.
And Canada.
There's nothing inevitable about the global financial crisis. We were sitting on top of the United States, and guess what we kept being told? Gosh, you guys are really boring. Don't you want to do more exotic derivatives? Don't you want to do subprime mortgages? And our answer was no. We had regulators that kept their brains in the middle of the froth. Nothing was inevitable about the devastating fact of it is, it wasn't globalization, it was people. Yeah. And to Ian's point, the narrow mandate we give banks and financial institutions, and I spent 2 years at Finance Canada writing our federal budget, so I've lived in this culture. It's a very narrow mandate, and guess what? It's relatively easy. A lot of what we've talked about today at the Milken Institute has been relatively easy problems for elite people. no problem at all. But like, we can price risk. We know what we're doing. We know what the alternative futures are. The real challenge is bringing more people into the benefits of globalization. And I love your macro point. It's bang on. There's nowhere else we want to be in terms of health outcomes. Let me tell you, as a woman, I have way less of a chance of dying during childbirth today than in any other time during history, and seeing my children live beyond the age of 40.
Life expectancy is going down in the United States and in Great Britain.
That's because of rising inequality.
But the global financial crisis, irrelevant to the crisis of capitalism,
No.
or actually slightly relevant to it.
Well, as Ailish
having too much fun.
said, and let me remind you of some historical evidence about the global financial crisis. It started with the U.S. subprime mortgage market. You can't get more domestic than that.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, housing is, so far as I know, not traded across borders unless you talk about the ingredients for housing. So what I think you're worried about is global financial flows, right, could be a source of global disruption. And that's a very big topic because not all capital flows are the same. And especially the ones that are direct investment and boring equity type investments, or the more exotic derivatives that are traded. And even the BIS would tell you, no problem with exchange rate swaps, no problem with interest rate swaps, right? It's when you get into that financial engineering fringe, right, that says, I can create an instrument to do whatever you want. And even if you were to go there, the missing ingredient that caused the great financial crisis was all of these fancy derivatives were stuck into the accounts of pension funds, insurance companies, and mom-and-pop shops without being traded. So as risk changed, these instruments were not marked to market and didn't reflect the underlying risks. One of the projects we have at Milken is to say, let's not get rid of the baby with the bathwater, right? Let's try to use derivatives in a smart way. Let's use derivatives for what they're designed to do, which is to be an early indicator of risk. But you can't be an early indicator of risk if you don't trade the stuff.
If they're not priced.
And the key is getting the market to price the stuff moment to moment and getting analysts to look at what's underlying these derivatives and say, these values are changing and that instrument should change in value, and you, the owner of that instrument, should be the judge of that. So to again, a shameless plug for Milken, we have something that's called a Global Opportunity Index that tries to give investors a sense of what countries have the greatest opportunities for capital to come in and make use of. And there are economic indicators, GDP growth, unemployment rates, and so on. But the key indicators that moved our European numbers this year were social indicators, business climate, regulatory environment. These are the indicators that are so important for businesses to get a sense of where the opportunities are. And so when you talk about the global financial crisis, the kind of capital flows you want to promote are these smart decision makers, business guys who say, I'm going to go into, in this case, the UK, which is number one, or Switzerland, Norway, Sweden, Netherlands, and some of the Ireland and Germany and Finland, because they have the best opportunities as indicated by economic, social, and financial indicators.
So one thing that worries me about this emphasis on objective measurements like indicators, it used to be the case that if a bank was making a big bet on lending to a householder's a mortgage, it would be a local bank, and you knew the local people, you could judge their character, you could judge their predictability. You were making a bet on somebody that you know on the basis of a lot of informal knowledge, but good knowledge of that person's character. Now, you've destroyed that connection. Banks are lending money to people they've never seen on the basis of a bunch of indicators that might well be distorted by all sorts of things. Isn't local knowledge the key to stability, and isn't globalization inherently destabilizing when it comes to finance?
I don't know the financial condition of my neighbor. I don't know the financial condition of a lot of the people living in my town.
But local banks did. Local bank managers did.
No, they didn't, because they don't have access to IRS numbers, right? It's only when you apply and the applicant gives you indicators. In other words, transparency and disclosure, that's really key, right? And to make financial instruments work, you need transparency and disclosure.
Whenever I hear the
different.
words transparency, I think another crisis is coming.
Why? Because AIG used to be they disclosed everything. They give you
Then there's no
volumes and
trust.
volumes of stuff, but it was never transparent because it was written by lawyers.
institutions.
So I think one of the things that we need to assure ourselves of is how do we make use of the tools that we have to ensure financial stability and at the same time move capital to where it's best used. And I think that's the world where we haven't reached it, and our failure to reach it resulted in the global financial crisis of
Too much
2008.
confidence in so-called objective indicators. I want to ask people now about the issue of what we do about the losers before opening up to questions. There's a whole series of sort of very predictable rhetoric about investing a bit more in education and training, which people have been talking about for 30 years and has done very little. What can you do about the losers? Is there any interesting new thinking about helping the losers from this process? Ailish.
Well, I work with Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and he has one challenge for us public servants, and that is to see people. And I know that sounds really simple, but as someone who's done a lot of macroeconomic work, I mean, you're into the aggregate, you're into the mean, what's the median, whatever. I mean, see people. And what that means is that you're going to have to do several mental exercises. Put yourself in the mind of 10 people whose lives you've never experienced. Have you invited them to tell you what they need? Have you invited them into co-creation, whether it's for a product, whether it's for a service, whether it's for a digital offering? And I have to say, truly, my mind has been blown in several instances where I thought we at the Trade Commissioner Service were offering a fantastic suite of products. And when we really started reaching out to a greater diversity of Canadians and hearing what they needed from us, you know, a lot of our assumptions were blown. So I haven't given you a magic answer because I do think local knowledge and having local solutions is incredibly important. I think it is going to come from increasingly involving youth, not least because what I can tell you now is, like, at 42, I'm a dinosaur. I mean, I'm watching my child showed up and touched my newspaper the other day. Yeah, I still get a newspaper, and said, "Mommy, it's not working," because he was trying to enlarge a picture. His brain is different than mine. And we do ourselves a disservice if we think all the answers are in this room, is all I can say. And yet education does sound boring, and yet I have to tell you, I think it's the most interesting topic, particularly for the United States of America and Canada and the UK and many others who have public institutions that truly reach a diverse population of citizens want to help, because I think that development, and you talked about it, adaptability. We can't educate our children for the future because we don't know enough about the future. But skills, adaptability, and I'll end it there, a lifelong sense of curiosity. I mean, Ian, you have it. Your book with Chris is absolutely fantastic. How do we instill that? Because I loved your point about, you know, mountains. Where are the places that people are ready for change? How do we help people cope mentally? I mean, levels of mental illness are going up, not actually because it's new, but it's this pace of change and being able to cope with it. I mean, let me ask the other panelists, because I think, again, it's not going to be one answer. It's actually we need 100 answers.
Ian, what's the answer? We've had 30 years of the repetition of the same mantra, which has failed. What are some good new ideas?
I think, you know, one word I would say mobility, which is ability to change, not only what one does, but where one is, because economic geography is becoming more and more significant. If you try and understand what's going on in the US, for example, what's happening in these Midwest towns, where life expectancy has gone down, where mobility, people's chance of moving home, is half of what their parents were. Their unemployment rates are double of what their parents were. Their chance of getting a job are much lower. But they can't go to where the jobs are, which is record low unemployment levels in the dynamic cities. The same is true of London, the same is true of Paris, Frankfurt, Munich, Berlin, Shanghai, Mumbai, etc. They can't get there because rents and house prices to incomes are at record highs. So mobility, housing markets, transport systems, congestion, the tail off. You used to go to a dormitory town around the dynamic cities. You can't do that anymore because the dormitory towns are also outpriced now, and the transport systems are more and more congested and more expensive. You basically spend all your income commuting. That's not on. Social security nets, but not only for yourself, also for your parents and kids. You can't leave your elderly parents in the town that you were born or wherever they are, because there's no care home anymore, so you end up looking after them. Inter-country is actually, this is one of the many reasons I believe in the European Union. That's always been the way we've escaped inequality, is move country, move to another place where the jobs are. And, of course, I'm violently against the UBI idea. Pay people to not work, that is not the solution. There's lots of reasons why it's bad, but one of the reasons is, of course, it doesn't add up arithmetically. As an economist, you cannot support that idea that you get universal.
Ask people how they feel when they're on UBI.
And the OECD has shown that it increases inequality and poverty. But also, if you're trying to understand the opioid pandemic in the US, a lot of these people are just paid to stay home and watch TV. People need meaning in work. They need networks. They need what work gives them, which is status and real challenge. Creating work, which does that, and that means creating work, including home care work, mentoring work, part-time work, all these new variations, and how that's going to work with pensions and careers is, I think, central as well. Education, absolutely. Flexibility, and what Chris and I try and do in Age of Discovery is talk about that. But let's not also get into a situation where we educate people and they don't have a job and they can't move. It's almost impossible to take jobs to people. And it's much easier to move people's jobs. The final point, if I can, because you provoked me on this localization idea with banks. One of the great benefits of global institutions is they spread risk if effectively managed. You know, one of the reasons I was against the UK Banking Commission's suggestion that we break up the banks and create local. If you have a whole lot of local institutions on the same street, they are more vulnerable to a pandemic, they're more vulnerable to Hurricane Sandy or terrorist attack or any other event. Geography matters in terms of risk as well. And one of the great aspects of globalization is you can have diversification of assets, ideas, people, and risk. And if that's effectively managed, you have a much more resilient system, which is one of the reasons why the global economy is growing so well, because we have more and more engines of change and drive.
You two, the same question, and then I want to open it up to questions. What do we do? Bill, first about the left behind.
Again, the social policies that are needed are pretty obvious. The key is, how do we finance them? And we come back to a financing option of how do we get the resources to finance those who are left behind. So, and that's more of a political and social question, and as an economist, where I have my own personal opinion, but there's no economic magic bullet, except to say that whatever you do, you can't give the education to the person to get him that job, because you have no way predicting what the next job is going to be. I have a 14-year-old and a 16-year-old, and I'm hard-pressed to advise them what skills they'll be needing for their future employment. But instead, I want them to learn how to adapt themselves, to be able to learn how to use new technologies, and to even create those new technologies. So having the flexibility that Ian just mentioned, that's really key. And institutions that are flexible enough to promote that and not allow abuse is something that we haven't quite come to yet. And unfortunately, that's going to be where we're going to have to find the answers.
I'm not sure I have much to add. I mean, I agree with what everyone said. One point I would make is on the first panel that was here this morning, I heard someone say, you know, how are you going to retrain a truck driver, you know, who's been displaced or whatever the industry might be. And in my view, I do think you can offer training. And the problem, as you said, this has been the rhetoric for the last 30 years. It's not worked. Well, that's because it's never been truly supported, right? We have a program in the United States. It's rather anemic. Trade adjustment assistance, they get some training, but it's not very substantive. And I actually grew up in the middle of the country in a small town in Missouri. I see it firsthand. My family still lives there. My parents are retired there. And so I see the disconnect between the thriving cities on the coast. There are thriving cities in the Midwest. Kansas City is a thriving city. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is a thriving city. St. Louis, Missouri is, they are thriving. But in the small towns around the country, it's not just the Midwest, out west and so forth, that's where you see the real disconnect between a growing economy and what those people are experiencing in their real lives. But I do think you can, if you get training, those people do want to work, right? So they don't want to be paid not to work. They do want to work. I see people driving, they'll drive 2 hours one way for a job and back and happily do it if it's a well-paying job. So I think that is one to brush it off and say, well, we could offer that, but how are you going to? People aren't going to be able to do that. They're too old. They're in their 50s, or they don't live near the job. They can't get to it. I don't think that's entirely true. So.
Thank you very much. I'd like to open it up to questions. We've got 6 minutes left to discuss a slightly large subject, but sir, please. No, the microphone is just coming.
Hello, yeah. First of
And
all,
can you introduce yourself as well?
David Walker. I work for Citibank, based here in London. First of all, to the panel, thank you. A tremendously stimulating debate. And I think, distilling everything you said, there's a huge number of challenges and risks out there. Bill, you said derivatives should be an early indicator of risk. And yet markets seem to be historically low volatility, they're incredibly sanguine. Are we missing something?
Yes, it's the measurement of the risk, right? Yes, the VIX index is historically low, but the skew, right, is extraordinarily out of historical numbers. So you have to take the right indicators to find where the risks are, because the type of risks are changing all the time. The usefulness of some derivatives is to indicate where the fat tails are. And what sectors they're located in. So you might see high returns, but you want to have some way of identifying these fat tails. So I don't want to go into statistics lessons, but to say, I think the message here is that the financial markets are a great source of information. You just have to learn how to mine that information and to develop reliable indicators. And one of the things that I advocated when I was at Citi was that we need more structured products as a source of financing for, say, infrastructure. Relying on local banks that have a couple of $1 billion worth of balance sheet around the world is not going to finance the trillions of dollars that you need to make the investments. But if you can tap the insurance companies, endowments, and pension funds globally who are looking for high rates of return, and you can use structured products to funnel them into investment opportunities in Asia, Europe, and even within the United States. But the key is to structure these products properly so that they are valid indicators of risk and not distorting and adding risks of their own.
Any more questions from the audience? I see anybody at the back? There, please, this lady sitting here.
I wonder if you could comment on how you deal with data flows in the trade environment, how you deal with ownership of data and regulation of data cross-border.
To start off
Yeah,
with that.
sure. I think what we've, first of all, tried to do is establish a regulatory environment where we have some key principles. And talking about how companies code ownership, privacy concerns, where that data is housed. It is a bit where you sit is where you stand. If you're very strong in this area right now, global flows are very sensible. There's a counter argument around data localization. And actually, the EU is at the epicenter of some of those discussions. I'm very interested in what the UK view on this is going to be. I think in Canada, we've discovered essentially like a hybrid position between the US and the EU that's going to work for us. And we hope globally. I think the real challenge is when we get into data flows with countries, I would say specifically in Asia, who are going to have much stiffer rules that are going to drive businesses into investment. So I think, we've been through, we talked about this golden age, and in fact, I think one of the things the panel hinted at was that at some point, voluntary export restraints or specific managed trade actually worked out quite well for the two parties involved. The point is that at a certain point, you have to evolve beyond that. And I can see exactly the same trend coming in data, which is that at a certain point, it makes sense to argue for localization, but then you have to be ready at a certain level of development to tip into openness. And that is incredibly hard to do with existing systems. So there's no easy answer on that, except to say that I think it's something that we're acting with greater intention. And this is, again, an area where places like Milken bring industry and government together, and those kind of collaborative discussions have to be happening.
The United States has a very open approach to data flows. The United States does not have data localization requirements, and in fact, is very strongly opposed to those sorts of requirements. You do see an increase in data localization requirements in the last few years, around the world. More and more countries are putting in place requirements that the data be housed in their country. And that was one of the achievements in the Trans-Pacific Partnership, was that there was a prohibition on that kind of restriction. Now, the United States did carve out financial services, and that was a point of contention for some constituents in the United States were very unhappy about that carve out. But at the time, that was a part of the TPP. The other aspect is privacy rules, which of course are very strong in the European Union and the UK. The United States doesn't have a general privacy law. We have more of a piecemeal approach to that. But we are able to interact, if you will, in data flows between the EU and the United States, because historically, because of the safe harbor, that's all now sort of up in the air. But so from the U.S.'s point of view, the U.S. wants to see free flow of digital data.
Well,
And I'm just repeating what the U.S., again, like, I'm not part of that. I'm just repeating what is in the public domain as to what the U.S. government's position on that is.
well, the clock has just hit 0, so I'd like to thank the panelists extremely much. Thank you for a very vigorous discussion, and it's now time for lunch. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
You managed to stimulate us.
No.